afternoon and good evening, everyone, and happy Earth Day to you all. And welcome to another session of Quad Talks, where we bring you all together to engage, interact, and be inspired. These talks are brought to you by KIS and Cody Friends International, which is a nonprofit organization here in the United States. They're in the United States. Okay, I can't believe this is going to be our last Quad Talk for the season. It's been a great experience curating these talks for all of you. In fact, I was just telling someone yesterday that it feels like I'm taking you all on a learning journey with me because I've learned so much doing these talks, listening to our speakers. We've curated almost 15 alumni speakers in this entire session of 6 months. And it's been a great journey. And I appreciate all of your support and encouragement that I've received from the start of this virtual community experience. Before we go any further, I just want to say a few thank yous. I want to say a thank you to Paul van der Arde and David Mayer, who inspired us to use this virtual space to engage. I'd like to thank Mona Uman, who assisted me very much in the programming of these Quad Talks. Bill Martin, who joins us every night to help with crowd management. Mary Lowry, who's actually the key instigator of these talks. And last but not least, Sylvia Trotman, who is literally my right-wing woman. And we've been working day and night shifts to get these shows on the road. So thank you very much. Hand it over to a special person here tonight, and that is none other than our principal, Corey Stixrud, who also happens to be Nik's best friend as well as classmate. So over to you, Corey. And if you could also give us a quick update on what's happening here in Cody.
Oh, sure. I'll thanks, Manjusha. These have been wonderful talks. So thanks to you and Sylvia and Bill and everyone else involved. A quick update. Sure. Well, it's been a strange last few. It's been fantastic to have our students back. They started to come back at the end of January, and they were able to be here in February and March, and now into April. But given the current situation, the worsening kind of pandemic across India, and the fact that borders are closing and flights are being canceled and restrictions are being put in place, we're actually in the process of closing down the semester very, very quickly, which is just heartbreaking for these Cody kids, because as we all know, I mean, these are big events in one's Cody experience and life. So it's been a remarkably difficult time here at school, but we are fortunate and thankful that we haven't had any residential students have cases, which would be tragic. And so, that's where we stand. And obviously we're kind of facing uncertainty with everyone else. But yeah, so thanks to everyone for your encouragement, your support, your prayers across the world. We just keep doing what we do. And now let's move on to this evening, if that's okay. Welcome to tonight's edition of Quad Talks. It's just exciting to be here in partnership with Cody Friends International and all the work that's been gone into this. Our topic tonight is zoonotic disease spillovers, hosted by the amazing and effervescent Sylvia Troutman-Rogers, who's here today. We are delighted to be joined this evening, this morning by our special guest, Mr. Nik Sekhran. Nik is a friend and a Cody classmate of mine from the accomplished and diverse Cody class of 1986. I remember first meeting Nik on a hike to Doctor's Delight, probably in about 1980, a year or a semester or a year before he joined KIS. Nik and his charming partner Chrissy were frequent visitors to Cody and surrounding environs. And Nik is currently the Chief Conservation Officer at the World Wildlife Fund in the U.S. He oversees work on wildlife protection, forests, oceans, market-based conservation solutions, and climate change. Prior to joining WWF in 2018, he served as the chief of the Sustainable development at the United Nations Development Program, the UNDP, where he oversaw a large team that was providing programming and policy support to countries in the different arenas of sustainable development. He earlier served as the head of the UNDP's $1.7 billion Ecosystems and Biodiversity Program. He has worked on the ground in conservation and development fields in over 50 countries. He has lived for many years in Papua New Guinea and South Africa. He is now based in Washington, D.C. He has family homes in Kodi, as well as in Betty's Bay, South Africa. If you ask me personally, Nik is just a smart guy, a good friend, a great classmate, and fun and smart, and we're just lucky to have him here today. Over the past year, Nik has led work at the World Wildlife Fund, interrogating the root causes of zoonotic disease spillovers, such as COVID-19. In his presentation tonight, he will table his findings, helping participants to understand the underlying nonlinear dynamics that give rise to the spillovers of animal disease into human populations. The analysis suggests that to decrease the likelihood of novel zoonotic disease outbreaks, we need to prevent the preconditions that enable animal diseases to spill over to humans. An interesting topic, a relevant topic, one that obviously has vast repercussions for all of us and for the planet. Turn it over to Nik.
Great. Well, thank you, Corey. You're really very kind. It's great to be here with all of you today. I know it's difficult times, but the topic for our dialogue today is very pertinent to the times. Trying to unpack the genesis of COVID-19 and other zoonotic diseases, and by that I mean diseases that have their origin in animals, whether those be wild mammals or domestic mammals or birds or indeed snakes. Now, in my past life in the UN, and now this is not going, yeah, here we go. In 2015, I oversaw a team which, amongst other things, worked on supporting UN work in 3 countries in West Africa, Sierra Leone, Guinea, and Liberia, which were at the epicenter of an outbreak of Ebola, which is a hemorrhagic disease. I'm sure everyone on the call today will recall that outbreak. Now, Ebola is a forest disease. It's found in areas which have been degraded. It appears to have its origin in fruit bat populations, a particular genus of fruit bats found throughout Africa. If you look at the lightly shaded pink on the map, you'll see populations extend into South Africa. We had a home in Pretoria, and it was one of the most lovely things on a summer's evening after a thunderstorm to hear the beep, beep, beep of these fruit bats and as they fed off the figs on the tree outside our bedroom window. Anyhow, this outbreak in 2015 was one of the largest outbreaks, was the largest outbreak indeed, of Ebola, and the first in West Africa, and it had quite calamitous impacts for the 3 affected countries. Now, if you look at a timeline from the 70s, through to the outbreak in 2014, 2015, most of the Ebola outbreaks historically had been in the Congo Basin and in the Sahelian zone, particularly in South Sudan, in areas that had been degraded. And the scale of outbreak, because these spillovers occurred in areas with low population density, largely rural areas, were generally small and contained, although calamitous for local populations. In 2014, 2015, in the 3 countries in the Guinea region, you had a spillover which caused high mortality in urban areas and was therefore incredibly serious. Now, the UN played a key role in assisting on the health side in terms of addressing the morbidities and the casualties. But as the crisis continued, we turned our efforts to recovery. And in that context, My team was part of a larger group who helped design a recovery package, which was subsequently presented to UN member states as part of a pledging conference, and billions of dollars were pledged for recovery. Now, in the preparation to that, I suggested that it would be useful to include in the recovery investment package actions that address the root causes of Ebola, in particular, the consumption of wild animals and bushmeat. And it was interesting. We did interrogate what that would take. It's certainly very difficult. We would have to change behavior, bushmeat being a staple in parts of the forest zone. But a colleague responsible for the recovery suggested that it wasn't warranted because the Ebola outbreak was a black swan. Now, he was referring to Nassim Nicholas Taleb's book, which looked at financial meltdowns. And a black swan in that reading is an event which is highly unlikely to ever happen. I mean, it's got an infinitesimally small chance of happening. Huge impacts were it to happen, but very difficult to predict. I might suggest actually that there is another metaphor for the black swan, which was used commonly in 17th and 18th century Britain. Those of you who know European birds, you'll know that all European swans are white. And so it was thought to be incredibly improbable, impossible, in fact, that a black swan would exist. And it wasn't until the first Europeans ventured to Western Australia in the 1700s that they first discovered black swans. So they do exist. And so the fact is that people were wrong in suggesting that they didn't. Now, the fact is that in recent decades, 3 to 4 new infectious diseases have emerged each year. And over 3/4 of these come from other animals, so therefore are zoonotic diseases. And that 60% of the emerging diseases come from wildlife. And so, and from animals more broadly, including domestic animals. And so it stands actually that zoonoses cause about 1 billion cases of disease a year and cause millions of deaths every year. This is not a black swan. If you have a look at the rise of some of the new emerging infectious diseases, I mean, these would be familiar to many of you, some of them, such as Zika, which has had major outbreaks in Latin America in the past few years, Ebola, which I spoke about, COVID-19, of course, the swine flu, H1N1 and SARS, and of course, HIV. There are 2 diseases here, Nipah and Hendra, which are quite interesting. Nipah was an outbreak in Malaysia and 4 other countries in 1998 to 99, and was transmitted to people from pigs, and it causes an acute respiratory distress. And the key issue there is, again, they have an origin in fruit bat populations, a different genus there to the one we see in Africa. And it so happened that the husbandry system for pigs in Malaysia, typically you would have pigs housed in pens underneath mango trees, and as the fruit bats fed on the mangoes, they came into contact with the pigs, and the pigs became infected, and therefore through the pigs, people. Now, these pathogens have a number of pathways in terms of how they might infect people. Some are vector-borne, such as Lyme disease, and those of us who live in the US will know, especially in the east coast, in the forest zone of the US, will know Lyme disease, and it affects many, many people, debilitating illness. That has its reservoir in animals, so these vector-borne diseases, and have an intermediate host. In the case of Lyme disease, it's a tick. In other diseases like West Nile virus, it's a mosquito, and therefore affect people, but they cannot be transmitted from person to person. And there's been a big expansion in the incidence and the severity of Lyme disease across the country in the US, and indeed a whole host of emerging tick-borne zoonotic diseases in the US, some of which are really frightening, one of which, by the way, causes severe symptoms if you eat mammalian meat, and amongst other things. So I won't get into that today, but this is a global problem, and we're seeing different diseases emerge in different places. The second is a vector-borne disease, which had a narrow origin, but is now restricted to people. So, malaria was thought to have originated in a wild animal, possibly monkeys, and some of the evidence from Borneo, transmitted through mosquitoes to people, and then from person to person through a mosquito. So that's another means for pathogens to move from person to person. A third is a disease like hantavirus or rabies, where the pathogen is contracted directly from an animal host, for instance, and typically rats and mice. And there again, you're seeing some increases and some outbreaks taking place, where climate change and land use change appear to be key factors. Then you have pathogens which have reservoirs in both wild and domestic species. And a good example of that is avian influenza. And these diseases can be transmitted from person to person. I mean, there's quite a long list here, so I'm just sort of laying out the different ways that these diseases can enter human populations, which a process that we call spillover. Then we have diseases like Hendra and Nipah, which I referred to, which are transmitted through livestock as an intermediary, often from bats or some other wild animal reservoir. Then we have diseases such as filoviruses like Ebola, which I spoke of, and Marburg and Lassa fever, which are transmitted from a wild animal, likely through another host wild animal to people, and then from person to person through the exchange of bodily fluids. And then finally, you have the coronaviruses such as COVID-19, but also SARS and MERS, which similarly have this transmission line from, we think, bats through an intermediate animal, possibly pangolins in this case, to people, and that can be transferred from person to person through respiratory droplets. So in all of these, and I'm going to unpack this in a second, some of the determinants which create the conditions for a spillover to occur are where you have high rates of deforestation and land use change. Climate change is a major factor. Agricultural intent, meat hunting, and then the wild trade and markets in marketing of wild animals. And often when you see a conjunction of these factors, you have the greatest risk. Last year, we created a paper, and after I finish speaking, I will post it on the chat box, or maybe Manjusha can share it with those of you participating today. We sort of unpacked all of this and laid out, these pathways in terms of disease transmission and laid out the fundamentals of disease risk, and then looked at some of the solutions that we think need to be brought to bear in terms of addressing this issue. And we hope that this time around, unlike in the case of Ebola, this won't be treated as a black swan, but we recognize that the impacts when these diseases occur are calamitous. Indeed, the situation is really problematic, as you saw earlier when we looked at the levels of morbidity and mortality associated with zoonotic diseases across the world annually, absent COVID-19. So the key factors that we need to look at in addressing these solutions are: one, deforestation and land use change; two, the trafficking of wild animals, species collection; three, animal markets, and typically the poor phytosanitary conditions where you have wild animals and domestic animals in the same market side by side. There are great risks of transmission, and that's what influences the risk ultimately. Diving a little deeper, you could see that these drivers, they're interrelated. As I said, when they have a conjunction effect between deforestation and fragmentation with the slaughter of wildlife, coupled with livestock extensification and intensification in these areas, you have a bigger and bigger problem and increasing the risk of spillover. Now, one of the issues in terms of what causes the spillover to occur, and it's not entirely understood, but it seems to be environmental perturbation causes the biggest risk. So land use change, deforestation. Bats, for instance, have a large number of viruses, and they seem to be the source for a large number of zoonotic diseases. They play a vital ecological function. but bat populations are often under severe stress in areas where deforestation occurs. And it seems to be, it's like what causes a disease to jump from a bat to a person, or jump from a bat to another animal to a person. Seems to be, maybe a question you might ask is what makes a bat sick? And I think you've got to look at this from a larger systems perspective in terms of what's happening in the environment to understand why these diseases emerge, why you see the spread, and how these factors come together in an interplay in terms of creating the risk. So we've unpacked the different root causes and the issues that need to be confronted in the three major forest areas of the planet where we see some of the greatest risks, starting with Southeast Asia and China. And here, a big issue are the wet markets. There's an enormous trade in wildlife, inter-country, within countries. Pangolins, by the way, are the most trafficked wild animal. Don't know if anyone here has ever seen one in the wild. I had fortune to see one driving up the Ghat Road as a child. Incredibly rare sighting these days, but a big, likely a possible intermediary animal in the case of COVID-19 in terms of transmission in we think China, Wuhan. So in this context, dealing with this trade is really critical. Globally, the illegal trade in wildlife and products amounts to some $24 billion. So this is not a tiny trade, it's a massive trade. It's a trade that we see in the United States in terms of the pet trade, with exotic animals smuggled into the country. It is not just a unique issue in Southeast Asia, but in Southeast Asia, we have seen a number of major zoonotic outbreaks which are linked to this trade, and this is a key issue that needs to be addressed with, and in conjunction, efforts to address the conversion of forests to cash crop plantations, such as oil palm, unsustainable logging, and so on and so forth. And I'm going to show you a picture of Sumatra and explain what's happening there in a minute to understand a little bit about what's happening, and the challenges we have in addressing it. So the sort of things we need to address in Southeast Asia, well, we need to intervene using supply chains to ensure that the palm oil we consume is sustainable and isn't contributing to deforestation. We need to be looking at the livelihoods of communities at the forest frontier, in parts of Northeast India and Myanmar, etc. You still have communities that hunt significantly. How do we address some of the risks associated with that? We need to be looking at infrastructure, and I'll come to that in a second. And underpinning all of this, and I'll come to this as well, is behavior change writ large. Now, in Western Central Africa, the situation is somewhat different. In Asia, these markets, wildlife is often a luxury commodity. It's not an absolute necessity. That's not to say there aren't communities in South and Southeast Asia which don't consume, bushmeat as a staple. But in Western Central Africa, there is a huge consumption of bushmeat, and it's critical complement to diets in places where you've got protein starved communities. It was a big issue in the context of the 3 West African countries affected by the Ebola outbreak in 2014, 2015, because there you had people depending on bushmeat harvesting during the intercropping period, what we call the lean period, typically a time where people were hungry, and absent arrangements to try and find solutions to that, you wouldn't make much headway. You have considerable deforestation in West Africa. A lot of the forests have gone, and the conditions for spillover there and in the Sudan Sahelian zone, which is on the northern edge of the Congo Basin, is high. There is a correlation in terms of the risk of zoonosis spillover with the level of degradation. So when you have a very virgin intact system, you've got low risk. As that system becomes degraded, that risk increases up to a point. And in fact, it has to be quite degraded in terms of that turning point. And then ultimately you get to a situation where you see reduced risk. But because that point of degradation is very high, in fact, as you degrade, you create that risk. And so it's the forest frontier that you need to be concerned about. And here, issues like the growth of commercial agriculture, logging, mining, and so on and so forth is key. And you know, the paper, which when you read it, you'll see lays out a whole number of general interventions that we need to take to address these risks. We did dive deep since we published that paper to look at the means and the measures that need to be taken in different parts of the world. And here it seems one of the key issues in West and Central Africa is community-based natural resource management, working with the communities, looking at issues like diets, looking at managing some of the bushmeat trade, and managing the markets domestically, and so on and so forth, and creating and strengthening early warning systems through biosurveillance in terms of addressing the issues as they arise. And then finally turning to South America, one thing interesting about South America is that most of the zoonotic diseases and most of the spillovers are not likely to, well, thus far, to cause pandemics because they're not diseases that can be transferred person to person. I happen to have been a victim of one of these diseases in South America. I caught leishmaniasis in the rainforest of Bolivia in 2001. This is a flesh-eating bug transmitted through sandflies and typically on the rise in areas where you've got deforestation. But it's not a disease that I could have transmitted to anyone else. You know, once I had it, I had it. The cure was systemic poisoning with antimony, which was rather unpleasant, and I still have side effects of that now in the context of having earlier onset arthritis. But it is a disease which, as I said, doesn't transfer to others, and that's typically true of the South American diseases historically. Whether or not that's likely to be true going forward and into the future, that's another matter. Here, and we'll come to this in a second, infrastructure and deforestation and the expansion of the agricultural frontier are key issues. I think everyone will recall the huge fires last year in the Amazon basin, particularly in Brazil, parts of Bolivia, and so on. And these are associated with the expansion of agriculture, clearance of forest, and associated behaviors. So I want to turn to two areas which we're looking at and which are the subject of our investment and which I've dug deep into. The first is deforestation. And I wanted to start by just sort of reflecting on the on infrastructure and the association of infrastructure, and in particular linear infrastructure and roads and railways and deforestation. It stands that across the world there's a very high correlation between the construction of roads and deforestation. In the case of the Amazon basin, 95% of deforestation occurs within 5 kilometers of a road. So road construction is a major issue. And I want to show you a rather incredible image, a time series of an area in Sumatra called Tesonilo. Those of you who know Sumatra, I first visited in the early 90s, and I have, you will know there's been massive deforestation. Since I first visited, we've lost nearly half of the lowland forest, possibly more, and the pace of change continues. So there's an area called Tesonilo, which is in Jambi, in central Sumatra. And this is what the area looked like in the year 2000. Now the white areas surrounding this forest, which is home to Sumatran tigers and many other iconic species, was largely oil palm in 2000. So this area was considered so important as a storehouse of the rich biodiversity of Sundaland, in which Sumatra is located, we worked hard in WWF, I wasn't here then, but to try and create a protected area. A road was built by a logging company and in the year 2000, between 2000 and 2004. And you can see here by 2004, the forest loss that is evident along that road. And then you end up in 2016 and you have a look at what happened then. All that red area was forest that was lost. The boundary there in blue was the area that was supposed to be established as the protected area. You can see most of it was deforested after the road was built. Actually, this was deliberate, and there's a lot of corruption associated with this. The process of gazetting a protected area takes a long time in Indonesia, as it does in many parts of the world. And vested interests basically had a massive land grab and sought to change the calculus, if you like, in terms of land use by invading and deforesting this land and then converting it to oil palm. So what you have left is that little green bit on the eastern quadrant of the map. And that is all that's left of that once large forest. And this was associated with road construction. Now we need infrastructure. People around the world need it for their livelihoods. 3 in 10 people lack access to drinking water. Significant numbers lack access to electricity. People are inadequately housed, and so on and so forth. It is anticipated that some $70 trillion worth of infrastructure will be built around the planet by the year 2050. And if you look at the Amazon basin, there are some 500 infrastructure projects currently under development, linked to some $130 billion in planned investments. That includes 150 existing dams, and then the idea is to build additional dams in the tributaries of the Amazon basin, tens of thousands of kilometers of new roads, and so on and so forth. And of course, juxtaposed against this is logging, mining, and so on and so forth. It stands that 75% of the built infrastructure that will be in place in 2050 does not exist today. And by our calculation, there'll be enough new roads in the next 30 years to circle the planet some 600 times. And it's not just in the Amazon and remote parts of Indonesia and so on that these roads are being constructed. There are big pressures in India to expand the road infrastructure framework system, including through national parks. There's a big battle on in terms of road construction through Corbett Tiger Reserve, and then similarly construction of a railway through Bandipur and in through Wayanad into Kerala from Karnataka. One of the key issues with infrastructure is the way infrastructure is currently planned is that the environment is addressed after most key decisions have already been made and a decision has been made to actually build the infrastructure. And then it's too late. What you want to do is to move it up environmental factors, including issues like disease risk, up front and to deal with it, as you're conceiving your infrastructure plan in the first place, rather than the specific infrastructure project, and to factor environmental needs and indeed environmental infrastructure, whether the environment itself can provide certain infrastructural services such as floodwater reticulation, storm protection, and so on and so forth. And so this is something which hasn't happened yet, and this is something which we are advocating for, and it's a large part of my work at the moment, working with some of the largest private sector infrastructure companies, as well as the major development banks, with a view towards changing the paradigm for infrastructure, applying the mitigation hierarchy, but placing an emphasis on the avoid part of the equation by moving the planning upstream from where it typically happens today. It's complex. It's really difficult to address. Typically, infrastructure projects come with a lot of associated politics, and there's a lot of corruption associated with infrastructure projects, a lot of vested interests. There's often, you can actually calculate a corruption premium sometimes in the price of this infrastructure. I mean, in the purchase of of concrete, cement, and all the other inputs into infrastructure. And so it's actually, from a systems perspective, something which is quite difficult to address, but I think everyone now realizes that we need to address it because the impacts are quite calamitous, not just from an environmental perspective, but also in terms of the social side. Turning to wild animals and the trade in wild animals, and as I said earlier, the juxtaposition, particularly in markets or in husbandry systems between wild animals and wild animal trade, often illegal, and domestic livestock husbandry. What we've been pushing for is to shut down high-risk wildlife markets and trade in high-risk species. China has done this with some exceptions for animals for medicinal purposes, and has done this early, and I think should be commended for that. Vietnam has proposed to do this. Well, it's on the statutes. It's still not effective. I think anyone who has been to one of these wildlife markets in Southeast Asia, and those of you who've lived in Thailand, the Chatuchak market, I mean, there's stuff which is sold openly and there's stuff which is sold under the counter. And so there is a big illegality dimension to this. So even if you have government sanction and closure of markets, or you then drive it underground, and so you've got to address that as well. And for that reason, you need to strengthen enforcement. And because the scale of the issue is so broad and so vast, you need some innovative ways of doing that. And I'll come to a couple in a minute. We do need to make this a collective global effort. As I said earlier, this is not an issue just for Southeast Asia and a problem that needs to be addressed far away. It's a problem that needs to be addressed near at home. Earlier in my career, I spent some time working in Venezuela and worked in part on the macaw. When the macaw is a large, charismatic, it's a genus of parrots. I think most people will be familiar with them. And the blue and gold macaw found in the Orinoco Delta was trafficked out of Venezuela, usually through neighboring Guyana into Trinidad and out to the US and into Europe. And of course, with the risk of certain bird-borne diseases, which is quite serious. So we need to ramp up public education. One of the things we've done at WWF is we've been basing the measures we have been propounding on opinion surveys and trying to understand, the market for these products and trying to segment it. And so we last year conducted a survey with partners GlobeScan, looking at COVID-19 and wildlife trade in 5 Asian markets. Now we rerun that survey this year and we'll have included the United States in that survey, but we will not publish that until May the 10th, but look out for that. What we found was that 93% of respondents were likely to support efforts by governments and health ministries to close all illegal and unregulated markets selling wildlife. So this is in the height of COVID-19 in these countries, and where there was high support for closure of these markets. Now I have to say there's a persistence issue here. During the Ebola outbreak in 2014, 2015, the government of Liberia shut down the bushmeat market in Monrovia. I have to say it is now up, alive, and thriving again. So these things sometimes are not permanent, and one of the issues we need to look at is to make it permanent. Now, 79% of respondents were extremely worried of the risk of future epidemics if no measures were taken to close these markets. And 9% either had purchased themselves or knew someone who'd purchased wildlife products from an open wildlife market in the past 12 months. And this is most important, likely to buy wildlife products in the future and likely to buy those products illegally were the market to be closed. Now these, the wildlife trade, it's massive. There's a huge amount taking place online, whether it's primates for the pet trade, whether it's pangolin scales. And so we have been working with a coalition of 36 companies across the Americas and Asia, including many Chinese companies like Tencent, but big American companies like Facebook, like Google, to end wildlife trafficking online. And it's a great initiative, and with our industry partners, it's just one of the exciting things we're working on, where we, using machine learning and artificial intelligence to trace and track these trades and then shut them down, working through a volunteer network and mobilizing volunteers to report this trade, looking at policy harmonization across the companies with a view towards addressing these issues, training company personnel, and then ultimately the users for the system that's been put in place to address it. And, you know, you may have seen this. Facebook announced the ban on live animals in marketplace and e-commerce pages. Well, this was all associated with that effort, which is now underway. But another exciting piece of work we're engaged in, and we started this with when we were dealing with the illegal trade of ivory in China and across Southeast Asia, is we started to use using geolocation based advertising through cell phones, GPS enabled, and people were in an area. So again, this was based on surveys and understanding who were the most likely consumers of these products. Turns out that young people in second-tier cities in China, so not in the Shanghais or the Beijings or the Guangzhous, but in the other smaller towns, were likely to be the biggest buyers and the most ones resistant to changing their behavior. And so basically with the companies in China and others and the cell phone operators using GPS enabling, reaching out to them when they were traveling in Thailand, Vietnam, and Hong Kong, and they get a beep and an advice on their phone that the purchase of such a product is illegal. And so that's the sort of thing we're doing with major companies in terms of trying to change the situation. It's going to take a village. It's going to take multiple interventions in order for us to succeed, but I've run out of time today and I look forward to the conversation. Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. We will be changing everyone into panelists so that we can all ask our questions. That was actually a very interesting talk and fantastic slides. I have to say, I'm a very visual learner. So that was very helpful to have those visual aids helping us there. So I thought I'd start off with my own question. Geopolitics is now playing a very key role in climate change and cutting down on carbon and carbon pricing and stuff. So we're having countries seeing other countries and joining in because of the influence and wanting to be part of the larger picture, wanting to be seen as part of the larger picture. How has WWF used this to play and influence countries in terms of things like wildlife markets, infrastructure building as well, deforestation?
Okay, well, that's an interesting question and very topical here in the United States because we've just had President Biden's climate summit, and where a large number of major announcements were made, including a big undertaking to protect tropical forests. One of the things we are focused on as we speak is the recovery to COVID-19. Many countries are in desperate economic circumstances at the moment. Some 77 countries have had to borrow from the IMF, International Monetary Fund, because they're facing a liquidity challenge. And I think we go forward. I mean, there are some countries, I think, Manjusha, was your family in Zambia? Is that right?
We were in Nigeria.
Nigeria, okay. Well, there was some Cody people who lived in Zambia. Well, the Zambian economy is tanked and is facing insolvency. And so, as we look to recovery, there's going to be significant efforts like we saw with Ebola, and I spoke of earlier, to invest in recovery. And we want to ensure that it's a green recovery, that we're not investing in perpetuating the problems of the future and creating the risks of future spillovers, but that recovery factors smart solutions such as the ones that I've presented into the equation. We've been talking to the managing director of the International Monetary Fund, Kristalina Georgieva. She wants our support in pushing Congress to get a $500 billion special drawing rights in terms of providing a liquidity base for countries. But And usually this will come with conditions for a green recovery. So these are the sort of things we're looking at.
Why do you say the South American zoonoses are not infectious? You said they're not, they haven't caused any pandemic so far. What do you see as the main reason? Are they not caused by viruses?
No, it's just that you've got it just so happens that the types of diseases that have been transmitted from animals to people there are not diseases so far, and I'm just saying so far, that have been easily transmitted person to person. And you only get a pandemic when you get person to person transmission. So, you get a one-off, interaction with wildlife, you catch a disease as I did, but you can't transmit it to someone else. That just happens to be, in general, the case in South America, quite different in Africa and in Southeast Asia.
Thank you. I have one more question. Has CITES done anything to stop the trade of these animals that are risk of transmitting zoonosis?
Yeah, well, this is $1 million question, and CITES is the international convention that regulates the trade in wild fauna and flora, and it's my wife is on the call, and I have to be careful what I say. She's a strong sustainable use CITES person. She's a crocodile specialist. But I mean, I think the problem with CITES, it's really struggled sometimes to enforce its own regulations. I know there's a push at the moment, including from the ex-CITES Director General and a friend of mine, John Scanlon, to sort of expand CITES or create a new convention to deal with these issues of the wildlife people interface. I suspect, though, it's going to be hard to achieve through that route. You can spend a lot of time negotiating in the UN and coming to some kind of compromise. So what's the point if you can't implement?
Thank you.
Anyone else?
I wondered if anyone would ask a question about what the risks were in India. There's a disease in India, KIS or forest disease. This is first detected in 1957 in Karnataka near Jog Falls. And it's had since then an annual incidence around 400 to 500 cases and some like 4% mortality. It's tick-borne, but also affects other primates, macaques in particular. And so it is not able to be transmitted person to person. But one of the issues with some of these diseases, David, in terms of asking your question, is not to say there may not be in future some kind of mutation which would allow for person to person transmission. So these are things we're watching. And in India, the actual risk factors are somewhat lower, except in perhaps the Northeast and so on, where you have a tradition of eating wild animals and so on, and rampant deforestation in places like Nagaland.
A question for Mary. I'm curious what you did in Papua. Have any zoonotic diseases developed there from birds of paradise, for example? Are you familiar with singing dogs?
I lived in Papua New Guinea for 7 years. I worked for the Department of Finance. I was an economist, and then I became the government economist in the Department of Environment and Conservation. I traveled widely through the country and remained closely linked to the country. You talk about singing dogs, they are incredibly rare. They were brought in by people, and these are dogs which have gone feral, like the dingo in Australia. If they exist in the Indonesian side of the island, not in Papua New Guinea anymore. But yes, I mean, early in my time, in my career, I wrote the seminal country study on biological diversity. I co-wrote it, I should say, on Papua New Guinea. And we had a chapter which I helped write with the Institute for Medical Research, which was on emerging diseases. And we were very focused on malaria, but there were other viral diseases which were of concern. And already then, and this is going back into the early 90s, we were concerned about climate change and the change in the distribution and risk of disease emergence. I'm not aware of any diseases from birds of paradise. I did have an interesting story. There was a friend of mine who was working up in the high mountains in Western Papua New Guinea, and she was a researcher, and she was studying cuscus, which is an arboreal marsupial, and up in the high canopy, and she caught this disease, not sure how, maybe a tick, etc., which was diagnosed as Southern Death Syndrome, and off she ran and went back to the States. Well, it wasn't Southern Death Syndrome. It was something which was unusual and no one had ever found. She survived, only to then come back to Papua New Guinea, and then very sadly, she had lost, in the interim period, there'd been a flood and all her PhD materials had been lost. So she then started again, went to Sumatra and studied orangutans. Quite an interesting story. But I remember being a young man in this association with this new disease, which again, didn't seem to be person-to-person transmitted.
Another question. So the question goes, everyone says it's probably South Asia's problem, Southeast Asia's problem. They're the ones who do wildlife trading markets. I don't eat bushmeat. So what do people who think that these zoonotic spillovers do not affect them, why should they be concerned?
Because everyone engages in some behavior which is contributing to the problem. I have to say, it is really unhelpful when we label certain groups or communities as being responsible. And I think, there's a lot of jingoism attached to that. For those of you who live in the US, you'll know that many people of East Asian origin are facing significant discrimination as we speak, as in some incredible figure, 9,000% increase in violence against people of Chinese or Korean and so on. And so we've got to be very careful not to label this as being a Chinese disease, etc. The fact is, and as I said earlier, there are big issues here in the US with the illegal pet trade and potential disease risks attached to that. And really important is that we contribute to deforestation through the product choices we make, whether it's buying, a good example, peanut butter. Much peanut butter has got palm oil attached, in it. If you go to Whole Foods, you can buy peanut butter without oil palm. I'm talking about the US here because I think many people are in America here today. But I mean, you're contributing to deforestation if you're buying unsustainable oil palm. So I think it is everyone's issue, and you've got to look at your consumption choices and look at the contributions you might be inadvertently making in terms of deforestation and loss.
Ian Lockwood writes, "Hi Nick, how about some comments on the challenges in the Palani Hills? From your point of view, the issue with Gore population spiking might be interesting to comment on. Also, I don't think WWF India has much of a presence in the Palanese while they are in the Nilgiris. Any plans for changes that you're aware of, especially now that there is a Kodaikanal Wildlife Sanctuary?"
Ian, interesting question. This is the subject of a longer conversation around the campfire in Kodi, talking about ecological change in the Palani Hills. For those of you who haven't been to Kodi recently, you will see a significant increase in wildlife numbers relative to what you would have witnessed when you lived in Kodi, when you grew up in the Palanese. And it's not just gaur, which you see everywhere, guaranteed sighting. We have a family home just beyond Shambhaganur on the cliff edge over there. And, around the house, we have samba, I've seen leopard scat, there are the last few Nilgiri marten, for those excited in that sort of thing. I've seen 3 there. And so there is an emergence of wildlife which you wouldn't have seen before. I mean, as a boy walking up to Roseneath, where we used to live with my mother, was in Kodi, it was interesting. You would walk after canteen, and it was fine as a young boy to walk. There was no tourists. There was no issue there of being abducted or hurt in any way. But you didn't worry about wildlife either necessarily. These days, you probably might think twice about doing that because you might bump into a gaur. We certainly wouldn't walk outside our property in Prakashapuram at night for that reason. So there's a big increase, and then you've also seen a big change in the ecology of the hills. And I think Ian has spoken about this, and there's a really interesting presentation he made showing the maps, of what Kodi used to look like. You're seeing a lot of shola recovery occurring under some of the wattle, in particular acacia, and some of the pine forests as well. and you're seeing a much more damp environment. You're seeing a lot more leeches. So there's a quite different environment in Kodi than one I was familiar with, and Corey back in the day when we went on hikes. As you will recall now, living there. The Gao population, interesting, and there's all this speculation as to why the Gao population is increasing. I think the single biggest factor is, well, it's twofold. One is in the 1970s, you had a huge outbreak of rinderpest and a collapse of Gao populations. Since then, you've seen the vaccination of domestic cattle, with big reduction in rinderpest and associated bovine illnesses, and that's allowed Gao to recover. And so that's one factor. And then the second factor is the cessation of hunting. I mean, back when I was in school, the pit Gao was still being illegally hunted, but I'm sure, Ian, we can debate this. As to the issues of what, well, the biggest issue has been the deaths that are occurring as a result of human-animal conflict in Kodi. It is happening. But in terms of the disease outbreaks, I'm sorry, I'm not in a position to comment. I don't think it has the fundamentals of a high-risk environment, let's put it that way.
I have a question from Jagdish Krishnaswamy. Nik, do you see a change in international development and finance post-pandemic to alter development pathways?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a mix of things in terms of the attention to climate and the pandemic, which is putting this up the totem pole. Certainly here in the US with the Biden administration, there was a big push, and we're working with the US Treasury, Janet Yellen, on some of these things. She's just appointed a climate czar, who's an old colleague of mine here, John Morton. But in the UK, which will host the Conference of Parties, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, later in the year, if it happens with COVID, Prime Minister Johnson is really active too, and so is France and others. So let's see what happens. Certainly, and this week there was a big announcements from the finance sector, in terms of looking at some of these issues and what you fund and finance. And so this is, watch this space. There's certainly a big push in that direction, but there are big, difficult structural systems-wide issues that would need to be addressed in doing so, and it's not easy.